Hi everyone, I'm Anna, and as Mike mentioned, I am going to update you briefly on what is happening in the wonderful world of transatlantic data flows, in which there is never a dull moment. I do think if someone were to write a film script about international data transfers, and I'm not suggesting that that's a good idea, by the way, but if someone were to write a film script about international data transfers, it would probably have more plot twists than The Sixth Sense, The Usual Suspects, and Fight Club combined. And you just know that we'd be sitting there in the audience at the cinema afterwards thinking to ourselves, so Max Schrems was Kaiser Soze all along? This week of all weeks, there are obviously 1.2 billion reasons to chat about data transfers. But before I get started, I should flag that the purpose of this talk is to discuss the EU-US data privacy framework and not the Meta decision, which obviously relates to the SECs. However, my colleagues and I are more than happy to have a chat with you about the Meta fine at the reception afterwards over a very large glass of wine. Or maybe something stronger. At last year's Data Protection Top 10, we discussed the announcement that the DPF had been agreed in principle. Over the last 12 months, the key development has been that President Biden signed an executive order to implement the DPF. And subsequently, the Commission adopted or published a draft adequacy decision in favor of the DPF. Now, before I talk about the discourse which has followed the publication of the draft adequacy decision, I thought it might be helpful to provide an overview of the DPF and its key features. Obviously, this is intended to replace Privacy Shield and act as and build an improved bridge for personal data to flow freely from the EU to the US. How does it do this? Well, by building into its framework the following features. The first is that US intelligence authorities will be subject to additional safeguards, one of which includes that their activities must only be conducted in pursuit of defined national security objectives. The second is the introduction of a two-layer redress scheme. The first layer enables an individual to complain to a dedicated civil liberties protection officer. If the individual is not happy with the outcome, they have a second layer of redress, which enables them to complain to a new specialized data protection review court. Another important aspect is that, similar to Privacy Shield, organizations will self-certify that they adhere to the principles of the DPF. And finally, to ensure sufficient oversight, the DPF will be monitored and a formal review will take place every 4 years. So what has been the public reaction to the publication of the draft adequacy decision? Obviously, this was always going to be a bridge over troubled water. And I can't say I necessarily enjoy comparing EU institutions and privacy advocates to sharks, but the metaphor actually works quite well in the context of this presentation, so I'm just going to go with it. So what sharks are infesting these troubled mid-Atlantic waters? Well, the first shark was the opinion of the EDPB issued in February. Although the EDPB took the opportunity to acknowledge the substantial improvements that had been made to the framework, they did express concern over, one, the lack of clarity regarding the rules on automated decision-making, two, the lack of prior authorization required for the bulk processing of personal data, and three, the lack of transparency regarding the decision-making of the Data Protection Review Court. Additionally, the EDPB recommended that the decision is only adopted on the condition that US intelligence authorities are required to implement updated policies and procedures to give effect to the principles of the DPF. The second shark is that the European Parliament earlier this month adopted a resolution calling on the European Commission not to grant adequacy on the basis of the DPF and to continue negotiating with their US counterparts. They expressed similar concerns to the EDPB. However, in particular, they urged the Commission to ensure that any future framework will be able to withstand legal challenge. Which brings me on very nicely to my third and final shark, which is, of course, the inevitability of a Schrems 3 challenge. And the fact that Max Schrems has already publicly criticised the DPF, and in particular has found fault with the Data Protection Review Court, saying that it can't truly function as a court within the meaning of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. So, where does that leave us now? In terms of next steps, the Commission will now probably consider the opinion of the EDPB and the concerns of Parliament and decide whether or not to amend the draft adequacy decision. Ultimately, this probably means that we are unlikely to see the adequacy decision being adopted until probably October 2023 at the earliest. So in a nutshell, the key takeaway is that deficiencies have been identified within the DPF and we're going to need a bigger DPF. Thank you so much for your time.